Hello and welcome to the program. Today, I'm Joke Rogers here in Lagos. We begin with the legal matters where a writer suing former U.S. President Donald Trump has testified at a civil trial that the ex-president sexually assaulted her nearly 30 years ago. Speaking to jurors in a federal court in Manhattan, the writer said, "I'm here because Donald Trump raped me. And when I wrote about it, he lied and said it didn't happen. He lied and shattered my reputation, and I'm here to try to get my life back." 79-year-old Carol, a former Elle magazine advice columnist, is seeking unspecified damages from 76-year-old Donald Trump, who leads the Republican field in the 2024 presidential campaign. Her lawsuit concerns an alleged encounter in the dressing room of a Bergdorf Goodman department store in late 1995 or early 1996, where she says Mr. Trump raped her before she could flee. However, the former president denied the accusations and maintained his scorn for Carol's case, calling her lawyer a political operative and the rape claim a made-up scam, adding that this is a fraudulent and false story, a witch hunt. A quick check on the weather now. Strong storms have whipped up heavy hail and fierce winds in the Vero Beach area of Florida. Authorities issued a severe thunderstorm alert for parts of the state, warning of hail that could damage property as well as strong winds. According to local media, some homes reported loss of power. However, there are no reports of fatalities or serious injuries. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Byrd, joins me now. Maria, good to see you today. It appears more and more allegations are unfolding against former U.S. President Donald Trump. What do you make of these controversies surrounding him?
These allegations surrounding him are one that I think many Americans are not surprised about. Many Americans were expecting that at some point we would definitely find out additional information around his lifestyle, his personal behaviors. When we look back at the Stormy Daniels case and other cases that have come out even during his administration, it's clear that this was something that I think Americans were not surprised about. But at this time, I think the question is whether or not this will have any impact on his reelection potentially, and especially his campaign.
So why are all these coming out now? I mean, nearly 30 years after.
30 years after, that's not uncommon. What we've seen here in the U.S., and we look back at the Me Too movement, there were many women that came out 30, 15 years after allegedly having received some sort of a rape allegation against someone. So that's not uncommon to see here in the United States.
Are these strategies or a direct attempt to dump Mr. Trump out of the political system as the 2024 presidential elections is nigh? I think we lost contact with Maria Byrd, which we apologize. We'll try and reestablish that contact so we can get more detail about all these issues. Let's move on quickly. Potential U.S. presidential candidate Ron DeSantis has hailed Israel as one of the most valued and trusted allies of his country as he visited Jerusalem during a foreign tour designed to improve his prospects as a statesman. Mr. DeSantis noted that his opposition as Florida governor to pro-Palestinian campaigns to isolate Israel, his support for U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and a 2019 solidarity trip he made to a Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank may not have put him in good light. He also echoed Israeli worries about Iran, which he blamed for killing U.S. military personnel in Iraq during his own service stint in the country.
We've seen the targeting of Israel by international organizations and by movements such as Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, BDS. And of course, hanging over all this is the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran hell-bent on the complete destruction of the Jewish state. And yet, through all these challenges, Israel stands tall as a beacon of freedom in a troubled region, an engine of economic growth and opportunity, and a center of innovation and technology that is the envy of the world. Israel is also one of America's most valued and trusted allies. Maintaining a strong U.S.-Israel relationship has been a priority for me during my time in elective office, and I know it's been a priority for the overwhelming majority of the American people. Jerusalem is, in fact, going back thousands of years, the eternal capital of the Jewish people. U.S. policy should recognize the truth.
Our Washington correspondent, Maria Byrd, is back with us. Maria, before we lost you there, I was asking if these were strategies or a direct attempt to dump Mr. Trump out of the political system as the 2024 presidential election draws closer.
You're exactly correct. We will see from both ends, from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, for those who might not be major supporters of the former president, that these are going to happen during this period. And so you're exactly right. This is a strategy that will likely be utilized against him. The challenge that we've seen in the past is that despite what strategies have been used to try to hurt the former president, he has a way of being able to really utilize the media and things like this to build up his base.
We know that the former president, Donald Trump, has denied these allegations. Is there a possibility that if Mr. Trump is indeed found guilty, he will face jail time?
There is a possibility. I mean, that is very unlikely. But if the jury and the judge decides that that is a sentencing that is most appropriate, if he was found guilty, then that would be something that is possible. But it really depends on, for those areas that he's been indicted on, how much of that, if any, he would be convicted of, and then what would be the appropriate sanctioning according to the law for those type of offenses.
Do you think this may, potentially damage his eligibility to be the Republican candidate, for the 2024 presidential election in the United States?
It really depends on how strong his base becomes. You have many Republicans in Congress today, and many that are part of the Republican National Committee that are strong supporters of the former president. You have others that are completely on the other side. The challenge that we're seeing is that what we might consider a traditionalist Republican, which is the Cheney era, the Bush era, we've not really seen that type of Republican come forth to state that they are interested in running for president.
Oh, it seems Florida is weathering a lot of storms, seeing that Donald Trump comes from there. But let's take a look at the weather in Florida itself. The storm that the people there are facing right now, there's been strong storm reported in Florida. Give us an update on that. I know that deaths and injuries have not been reported, but damage to buildings have been.
Yes, this is a bit unique time frame for Florida to be experiencing these type of storms. Typically, the hurricane season begins in late June, early July, and goes through almost October, November, and that's when you'll see these type of severe storms. But seeing these type of storms, as you mentioned, that are damaging buildings, properties, and forcing people to really be cautious and not to be on the roads at this time is a bit unprecedented. And the type of flooding that is being experienced is causing major damage to homes and businesses. And so this will be potentially a state of emergency that could be lasting more than just a couple of days.
Right. Thanks, Maria, for the updates on the storm. Of course, the political situation in the United States. Our Washington correspondent, Maria Byrd, speaking to us there. Let's move on to other stories. Turkish Health Minister Fahrettin Koca says President Tayyip Erdogan is in good health and would continue with his daily scheduled programs as soon as possible after he postponed some campaign rallies a day earlier. President Erdogan cancelled his scheduled campaign rallies for yesterday and today, citing health reasons. Late, he cut short a live TV interview during which he said he felt unwell with an upset stomach. Well, the crime rate in Haiti has doubled in the last year. This latest report on Haiti was brought to the fore during a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Special Representative of the Secretary General for Haiti, Maria Salvador, says gang violence is expanding at an alarming rate and that locals take laws into their own hands due to the lack of police presence. Meanwhile, local authorities say terrorist attacks, destruction of property, kidnappings, assassinations, and rape are the modus operandi of the gangs and called on the United Nations for assistance.
Gang violence is expanding at an alarming rate in areas previously considered relatively safe in Port-au-Prince and outside the capital. The horrific violence in gang-ridden areas, including sexual violence, particularly against women and girls, is emblematic of the terror afflicting much of Haiti's population. According to data collected by the Haitian National Police and by BINU, in the first quarter of 2022, 692 criminal incidents, that is, homicide, rape, kidnappings, and lynching, were reported. In the same period, in 2023, the number of recorded criminal incidents more than doubled to 1,647. Last month showed the highest incident rates since 2005. Faced with these increasingly violent armed gangs vying for control of neighborhoods of the capital with limited or no police presence, some residents have begun to take matters in their own hands. These dynamics lead indefectibly to the breakdown of social fabric, with unpredictable consequences for the entire region.
The European Commission is proposing that under a reform of the EU's fiscal rules, governments should ensure that public debt should fall over a 4-year period and stay on a downward path for a decade afterwards. The proposal, which sets no numerical target for how much the debt should fall, is likely to disappoint the EU's biggest country, Germany, which wanted to set an annual minimum GDP debt reduction target of 1% for each of the EU's 27 countries. The debt reduction will be the outcome of a 4-year plan of reforms, investment, and fiscal measures that would be agreed individually by the Commission.
For now and for years ahead, it is vital to maintain an anchor of macroeconomic and financial stability. This means reducing debt and keeping it sustainable, ensuring sound public finances across all EU member states, and building a solid base for future growth. Our proposals for reforming the EU's fiscal rules will help to do. Each member state should commit to a medium-term fiscal structural plan, so it's a real departure from today's one-size-fits-all approach.
And here in Africa, 4 Kenyan Christians have died while being rescued from a house operated by a starvation cult. They were found in an emaciated state due to a fasting session started by a local pastor. The circular East African nation is dominated by the Christian religion, and cases of worshippers being misled by their pastors have cropped up in the past. Police are still investigating the latest case.
The 4 who perished in Kenya's latest case were amongst 15 members of the Good News International Church, who authorities rescued in the coastal county of Kilifi.
We went there based on an information that there were some people who were cited by members of public having been starved somewhere and were just about to die. We rushed there and we were able to rescue about 15 people. And among the 15 people, 4 died as we were proceeding to hospital.
Police marked the locations of more than a dozen suspected graves in eastern Kenya, thought to contain the remains of the followers of the Christian cult, who believed that they would go to heaven if they starved themselves to death. The leader of the church, Paul Mackenzie, has been detained by police following a tip-off that also suggested the existence of shallow graves belonging to at least 31 of his followers, according to a police report.
2017 is when police got interested in this person. But I'll let you know, there are many other people we are following up, we are interested in, whom we believe are involved in similar issues. So there's a lot more happening, not just this person.
Kenya's Interior Minister Kithure Kindiki called for the group's leader to spend the rest of his life in prison, and that anyone who assisted him by digging graves or disposing of bodies should also face the harshest penalties under the law.
Coming up after the break, update on the situation in Sudan as diplomatic efforts continue to extend the ceasefire between Sudan's army and the rival Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. To the ongoing crisis in Sudan's diplomatic efforts are ongoing to extend the ceasefire between Sudan's army and the rival Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group. But the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, says more deaths will occur in Sudan due to outbreaks of disease and lack of essential services amid intense fighting. Fighting erupted between the Sudanese armed forces and a paramilitary group in which at least 459 people have been killed and 4,000 injuries reported. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization says it's carrying out a risk assessment to determine whether the seizure of a laboratory in Khartoum housing pathogens represented a risk to public health.
Already, the violence has taken a terrible toll on health. On top of the number of deaths and injuries caused by the conflict itself, WHO expects there will be many more deaths due to outbreaks, lack of access to food and water, and disruptions to essential health services, including immunization. WHO estimates that 1/4 of the lives lost so far could have been saved with access to basic hemorrhage control. But paramedics, nurses, and doctors are unable to access injured civilians, and civilians are unable to access services. In the capital, Khartoum, 61% of health facilities are closed, and only 16% are operating as normal. Since the conflict began, WHO has verified 16 attacks on health, causing 8 deaths. WHO is also concerned about the occupation of the Central Public Health Lab by one of the parties in the conflict. Technicians no longer have access to the laboratory, which means the lab is no longer able to perform its normal diagnostic and reference function. We're also concerned that those occupying the lab could be accidentally exposed to pathogens stored there. WHO is seeking more information and conducting a risk assessment.
Lab workers are forced to leave a laboratory and untrained people enter that laboratory. There are always risks, but the risks are primarily to those individuals, first and foremost, to accidentally expose themselves to the pathogen. But there are always obviously secondary risks that someone might leave that laboratory and infect someone else. But right now, the vast majority of people who have been infected with infectious diseases in Sudan are doing so because they're having to drink dirty water. They're doing so because they're crowded into basements and unable to access care. They're doing so because vaccination is not happening in young children. So when we look at biologic risks, as you put them, the main biologic risks to the to humans in Sudan is the fact that there's an ongoing conflict, there's ongoing war, and the denial of public health and health services to that population is what represents the major risk to health and the major risk of infectious diseases.
The conflict in Sudan has triggered a rush to extract foreign diplomats and citizens of various nationalities. Countries, including Nigeria, are racing against time, fearing the fragile ceasefire may collapse at any time.
Several countries have evacuated nationals by air, while some have gone via Port Sudan on the Red Sea, about 800 kilometers by road from Khartoum.
So there's going to be another crisis that no one has envisioned and no one knows how to deal with it. And I think the international community missed a golden chance when they evacuated the foreign nationals, that they could have gotten in some supplies, anything to tide things over. They didn't. So we are left with no security, no hope that these two men will actually cease all clashes or cease all, fighting. And we have no food security. So we're basically left to fend for ourselves with nothing.
Foreign countries have airlifted embassy staff out of Khartoum, the capital, after several attacks on diplomats, including the killing of an Egyptian attaché shot on his way to work. Some countries are also extracting their private citizens. On Tuesday, Britain launched a large-scale evacuation of its nationals on military flights from an airfield north of Khartoum. France and Germany said they had each evacuated more than 500 people of various nationalities.
Over the last few days, we have been doing extensive planning across government departments and with our international partners to take advantage of any improvement in the situation and begin the evacuation of British nationals in Sudan. I'm very pleased that a ceasefire has been announced by the leadership of the factions on the ground, and therefore we are initiating an evacuation plan. It is important to remember that ceasefires have been announced and have fallen apart in the past, so the situation remains dangerous, volatile and unpredictable. I've spoken either directly or through intermediaries with the leaders of the factions on the ground, calling for them to allow British nationals, dual nationals and minors to be evacuated, and we will continue to push for the maintenance of this ceasefire. Of course, it is impossible for us to predict how long this opportunity will last, and we're calling people forward in priority order based on their vulnerability.
The warfare that erupted between the army and the Rapid Support Forces, paramilitaries, on April 15th has turned residential areas into war zones, killing at least 459 people, wounding over 4,000 and cutting water, power and food in a nation already reliant on aid. Tens of thousands of people, including Sudanese and citizens from neighboring countries, have fled in the past few days to Egypt, Chad and South Sudan, despite instability and difficult living conditions there.
In the meantime, an official from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs says more than 1,000 Chinese nationals have been evacuated from Sudan by warships of the People's Liberation Army. Director General of the ministry's Department of Consular Affairs, Wu Ji, says the Chinese government is concerned about the safety of Chinese nationals, and the ministry is working with other authorities to guide the Chinese embassy in Sudan and nearby countries to evacuate its nationals as well as some foreign residents. Officials say China has the largest number of organized evacuees since the outbreak of the internal conflict in Sudan. Well, over 300 United Nations staff members and their relatives who were based in Sudan arrived at the Nairobi airport last night after nearly 2 weeks of conflict between Sudan's army and a rival paramilitary force. The crisis has sent growing numbers of refugees across Sudan's borders, with the UN Refugee Agency estimating 270,000 people could flee into South Sudan and Chad alone.
Finally out of harm's way and on Kenya's soil in Nairobi, UN staff heave a sigh of relief. The United Nations for Human Rights representative in Kenya, Caroline Van Buren, thanks the government for allowing their staff passage into the country.
On behalf of the UN, we would like to say a big thank you to the government of Kenya for allowing UN staff to be evacuated into Kenya. We will continue to work with the government to ensure that all of our colleagues who need to move from Sudan to Kenya will be able to enter Kenya.
The World Food Programme's Regional Director Michael Dunford is also there to receive the new arrivals. He says the agency is starting to think about how to re-enter Sudan, but is first prioritizing securing their workers.
We're desperate for the ceasefire to hold, for the principles to ensure that the chaos that has ensued over the course of the last week ends and the situation starts to normalize. But we needed to bring our staff out. The situation continues to deteriorate, continues to get less and less secure, and it was essential that non-essential staff were brought out and the dependents. We're going to house them here for the coming days, and then ultimately we'll assess the situation. The World Food Programme is already starting to think through how do we re-enter.
Dunford adds that even before the conflict began, Sudan was in need of huge humanitarian assistance, and unless there is a ceasefire, the need will continue to rise.
The VOA's Africa correspondent Mariama Diallo joins me for more on the situation in Sudan. Mariama, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, let me ask you about, the latest. I know that as a result of, this crisis, countries are racing to get their nationals away from Sudan. The report we just watched, about 300 members of staff of the United Nations landed in Nairobi yesterday. Any update on these evacuations? What's next now for those that arrived yesterday?
I think the clock seems to be ticking. We are about, I think, what is it? It's 7:30 my time, so up to midnight. And I think the ceasefire will expire. I think what we've seen the past few days is that, people rushing in and trying to do whatever they can to either evacuate their diplomatic staff or evacuate just their ordinary citizens. So I guess we'll find out after the ceasefire expires. And it's not just also the people who are being evacuated, it's also the Sudanese themselves who are trying to flee to neighboring countries, trying to flee to other places that are safer, the ones who are in Khartoum and other cities, depending on how, how calm or how intense the fighting and security and food and electricity issues are, you try to go somewhere else. So I guess we'll find out. I think the other thing that we're trying to find out is that the IGAD bloc has actually asked basically the two generals to extend that ceasefire for another 72 hours. So for that, I think the Sudanese army leader, Al-Burhan, has kind of expressed that he would be interested in doing that. But at this point, I don't think we've heard from the other side, which is the Rapid Support Forces, Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. I think the last time, usually, and which is kind of unusual because usually he's the one who agrees to the ceasefires, and usually the government lags behind to kind of agree or not. But this time around, it looks like it's the other way around.
Do you think we're about to witness another, mass displacement of people from Sudan to, neighboring countries? And I know that in this kind of situation, it's those neighboring countries that will now bear the burden of people fleeing the conflict in Sudan. Some might not leave those countries right away.
Well, that's been the issue from the beginning, and we've talked a lot about the surrounding countries that are the countries that surround Sudan. Sudan surrounds, so I want to make sure I get my wording right here. But all those countries have already also had a lot of issues. Each one of them has had some kind of chronic conflict or has had some kind of, the conflict happens and then it dies down and it starts again. So Sudan actually has had refugees before, has had, also IDPs from former, previous conflicts that it had. So now it's the other way around. I think all the whether it's the Sudanese, the refugees from other countries that Sudan has harbored the past few years, or the internally displaced people. And then all of that compounded with what's happening the past 2 weeks, I think definitely there is an exodus to, the neighboring country, whether it is Djibouti, it's Egypt on the other side, you have Ethiopia, you have South Sudan, which is also another one that's right there. And I guess both countries have been dealing with their own conflicts. So definitely, I think we will see, it's already been seen. People are leaving, and I'll actually give you an example. So our own reporter on the ground who's been doing amazing work has kind of taken the trek to get to Port Sudan, which a lot of people have been using in the past few days to try to get away. So yes, there is a lot to come, a lot more to come, and I guess we'll find out after this this ceasefire. And I put it in quotes because some people feel like there was never a ceasefire because clashes were reported. They are still hearing gunfires and stuff, but at least I think it did die down enough that other countries were able to make a few evacuations.
So be that as may, how confident, is the regional African trading bloc that its proposal for an extension of a ceasefire, will actually take hold?
Well, it's a very good question because believe it or not, I've actually been waiting all day long for a call. I contacted them directly. They've been very responsive, I have to say. And for people who haven't been, I'm sure everybody at this point is tuned into what's happening in Sudan. After that initial emergency session they had 2 days after the war broke out, they designated 3 presidents. Those 3 presidents were South Sudan, Salva Kiir, Omar Gele from Djibouti, and Samia William Ruto from Kenya. Salva Kiir is actually the lead mediator, and I think the lines have been open between him and the 2 generals, between Al-Burhan and Hemedti. And I think today he actually gave a little report about kind of where it's been going. So I think the feeling I have is that the lines of communications are there. Actually, Ruto had proposed to host a mediation session. Salva Kiir has also proposed to host another mediation session in Juba. But I think at this point, I haven't really heard what's going to happen. So do they agree to leave Sudan and go to one of these countries to mediate, to participate in the mediation process, or they will have a ceasefire that is secure enough for the other 2 leaders to get to Khartoum and negotiate? But there's another issue on that, which I think the foreign minister from the Sudanese army just maybe a few hours ago did also talk about the fact that they will not negotiate with Hemedti. So it's a very fluid and complicated situation that changes, every hour, and we're following that.
Mariam, I suppose that, all these attempts by individual, African presidents now, asking to mediate in this crisis is possibly because of fears that this might escalate beyond, Sudan and those neighbors and, have a wider consequence for the entire continent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look at the African map, when you look at the size of Sudan, and you look at all the countries that it borders, and whether, from the DRC to Ethiopia to Chad, Chad itself has had in the past few years, I think, 500,000 refugees that they took already from Sudan, from previous conflict. And Chad, we know they've gone through their what was supposed to be an 18 months transitional government to kind of, basically switch into like some kind of a civilian rule. That did not work. When you look at CAR is another one where, you have a government that's being protected recently by, the Wagner Group, which came in, I think, in 2008 when the rebels were trying to take over, the government, and they were there to help. The rebels didn't go away. They tried again, I think, in 2020 or 2021. It didn't work. So that's another issue. And I can go on, whether it's Ethiopia with the Tigrayan issue, whether it's a DRC with the M23 and the multitude of other rebel groups, and Egypt on the other side. Think about also the Red Sea. So there are just and Yemen and Saudi Arabia. It goes even beyond the African continent. This is a very, very serious situation. Absolutely.
Mariama, thank you for the updates on that situation. The VOA's Africa correspondent, Mariama Diallo, speaking to us from Nairobi in Kenya.
Thank you for having me.